Welcome to the Truth Expedition. I'm your host, Mark Bischoffsky, and you have tuned into the program. We are going to dig for some truth in this crazy, insane, sometimes freak show of a world where the fact checkers lie and the government and the media propagandizes you and me, the citizens of this amazing and precious world. I am extremely lucky today. I'm lucky every week. The guests we've been able to get on this program, amazing. Today, I'm lucky for two reasons. Amazing guest, and I have a co-host today, my friend, David. If for those of you who don't know who David is, if he doesn't look familiar to you, David is the founder of Mask Off Minnesota. So if you're from Minnesota and you're not familiar with Mask Off, you need to go to their website, maskoffmn.org. So they're hosting amazing events. In fact, there's an event October 22nd at the Crystal VFW with Kenny Maurer. So first, let's get into who the hell's David. Why is he sitting here next to me? So David's my partner in crime, colleague in this fight for truth, this fight for health freedom. So thanks, David, for co-hosting.
I'm excited to be here. This is going to be a lot of fun today. Really looking forward to it.
Yeah, so David actually hooked me up with today's guest. We'll get into who Ken McCarthy is, Fauci's first fraud. We're going to get into the AIDS scamdemic. But David knows Ken from years back and actually connected us. And so how did you meet Ken McCarthy?
Yeah, so it's actually quite an interesting story how it all kind of came full circle. Back in 1998, a very long time ago, the very early days of the internet, I was in my business. I was really into marketing, and I wanted to learn how to do internet marketing. And Ken McCarthy was actually an internet marketing pioneer. And so I bought his course, his internet marketing course. It was probably like $300, $400 at the time. And it was a lot of money for me at the time, and it really changed my life, believe it or not. Of course, it had nothing to do with COVID, nothing to do with any kind of truth movement of any kind. It was all marketing. It was all business. It was internet marketing specifically. And that was 1998. I bought several of his courses since then, attended some of his conferences via recordings, and been following him ever since. And so it's pretty amazing to one day I was listening to a YouTube video talking about COVID, the COVID fraud. And I was listening to the narration, and the voice sounded a lot like this gentleman who I followed, Ken McCarthy, with the internet marketing courses that I purchased. And I'm like, gosh, it really sounds like Ken McCarthy's voice. And I listened to a few more. This is on Brass Check TV, his website for the truth stuff. And I said to myself, that's got to be Ken McCarthy. And I don't remember how I finally determined it really was him. But then I reached out to him and I said, hey, Ken, I've been watching your videos on Brass Check, and I run this thing called Mask Off Minnesota. And I don't remember when I first told him about the other stuff that I bought his course back in 1998. But yeah, so it's really come full circle. We've never actually met in real life until just recently. He was in Minneapolis, and we actually had lunch together just a few Fridays ago. Very nice gentleman, a wealth of information, so much knowledge. He's investigated so many things. Most things that most people don't have the attention span to look at. That's the thing with a lot of these truth things. I think a lot of the evildoers out there of the world, they know that the average person does not have the time nor the attention span, especially the attention span. Look at TikTok right now. Especially the attention span to look into anything. So I think they know they can easily get away with all these things because they know the average person won't look into it. And that's why I love the fact that we have Ken on here today, because if you go to his website, Brass Check TV, there's so many great topics on there. Of truth topics, but not. I mean, 9/11, a popular one, COVID, popular one. But Mark and I were talking about the bank failure.
Yeah,
he's got some great stuff on there.
The bank bailouts too, from 2008 banking scam there with the subprime mortgages and such. But yeah, so it's pretty incredible. I mean, Ken was a pioneer when it comes to the internet. And we're going to ask him today, because I don't think David and either of us know, like, when did he stumble into the truth movement? David and I kind of, I think, we spoke pre-interview here. It was kind of the 9/11 thing that got us asking questions. Building 7, there's so much there, and it has kind of led us to start questioning everything. And I think that's the case with a lot of people, maybe you as well, you in the audience, and it could be 9/11, and maybe Ken as well. So Yeah, I'm super excited. So Ken produced the documentary Fauci's First Fraud, and that was really what we're experiencing now is kind of the sequel to this whole AIDS scamdemic. I didn't know either, but I've done the deep dive, in interview prep here, and it's incredible, and I can't wait to pick Ken's brain to find out even more about Tony Fraudsy. and so much more. So again, if you don't know about maskoffmn.org, go to that website, sign up for the newsletter, go to the events, stay tuned, because we all know this isn't over. And I'm going to have David be a co-host as much as I can. Two brains thinking of questions to ask these guests is better than one. And David's just a good friend, and I'm just so grateful he's sitting here with me today to interview Ken. So we're going to wait here until Ken lands virtually on Zoom, and we're going to get to that interview. But thanks so much, David.
Yeah, that's going to be awesome. I want to just go back to 9/11 really quick. There's a lot of parallels between 9/11 and COVID. And so if you were awake to 9/11, I really highly recommend that you look into COVID a little bit, because they use a lot of the same strategies and techniques on us. And the reason why I think Ken McCarthy is such a great guest to have on here is he's an internet marketing pioneer, actually a marketing pioneer, not just internet marketing. But when you think about propaganda, propaganda is marketing. It's marketing with a very specific goal. That's meant to persuade a group of people, population of people, to believe a certain thing, or to act a certain way, or to feel a certain way. And so propaganda is marketing, essentially, and it's expertly done. I mean, these people that write these stories in the news, that write for CNN, that write for the New York Times, they are experts at marketing, essentially, and copywriting, which is writing words that get people to take action to invoke those emotions. And so I think it's really important that we have someone that's an expert at marketing that can really dive into the techniques that they've used on us, whether it's 9/11. COVID, even the AIDS stuff that we're going to get into today, which I'm really interested in hearing Ken's take on it. Because if you actually watch this documentary, I believe it's HIV equals AIDS, Fauci's First Fraud, the technical name of it. We also just usually call it Fauci's First Fraud. But if you watch that, I do believe it's still on YouTube, but if it's not, go to Rumble. If you watch that, you will see all the parallels with the AIDS scamdemic. And with COVID, it's amazing how they're just following the same playbook in a lot of different ways.
A lot of the same players.
Of the same players as well, which is amazing. So if you haven't seen this documentary, I highly recommend you watch it. It's incredibly enlightening, especially when you watch it from the viewpoint of what's happened in the last few years in the world, and the same players who have been propagating the same kind of messaging. It's amazing. It really is. So this is going to be a fascinating conversation with an expert marketer. And that's why I was so interested in Ken McCarthy's take on all of this, because when you're expert in marketing, you know how to make people take action, invoke emotion, get them to purchase things, And this is very similar. Now, they're not purchasing COVID. Maybe they are actually purchasing vaccines. They're not free anymore. Sometimes you have to pay for them now. But when you can, convince people, especially a huge population of people, to take an action like, I don't know, inject themselves with an experimental thing that's never been proven, to work on anyone before, that's extremely effective marketing. And so, even you might not like their marketing, but I will say that they're experts and they're really good at what they do. If you read some of the pieces by the New York Times on COVID, they really are really well written, and they're very persuasively written, where you read it and you really, sometimes I read it and it works on me even as I'm reading it. I'm like, wow, this is so well written. I really feel like I should go put a mask on right now, or I should go inject myself with a lethal injection. It's amazing. And we have actually a gentleman here, and I shouldn't say gentleman, a journalist here, Jeremy Olson from the Star Tribune, who's also an expert writer of propaganda. And if you ever read any of his pieces on COVID, just realize that you're reading someone's work who is an expert, who I'm sure is paid very well, because his stories are written in a convincing and persuasive way where you literally, whatever the action is that they want you to take, whether it's be fearful, you should put the masks back on this season, you should inject yourself, they're so well written that, like I said, even like the New York Times, when I read them, and I'm like, wow, I'm almost convinced myself. And I'm the founder of Mask Off Minnesota. So that's why I tell people, turn off the news. I mean, even the TV news, it's all meant to sell you a narrative. It's all meant to persuade you to think a certain way, to feel a certain way, to act a certain way. Turn it all off. I think journalism, it's a shame. We had Liz Collin at a Mask Off meeting about a year ago now, and she kind of debunked a lot of the stuff that's going on in the media right now, including, if you look on TV news, I only watch the TV news, by the way, Mark, when I'm at the gym, all right, because it's on the screens, on the TV screen. So that's the only time I ever see the TV news, and they have the little captions. And every once in a while, trying to read the propaganda a little bit, but turn it all off. It's all meant to persuade, and it's never helpful in any way. Oh, you can learn the weather. Well, that's good. You can learn the weather many other ways without having being propagated and persuaded by all the other stuff that's on the mainstream news right there. So.
Yeah. It's fluff too. I have the Care 11 app on my phone just to kind of check, just to see what are they reporting. I don't read the articles typically, but it's mostly fluff. They're not getting into what's really happening in this world. And, we are all victims to a certain degree to the propaganda. We've been propagandized, indoctrinated. I went to public schools and I'm trying to deprogram myself. And so I check myself every day. Could I be wrong? Could I be? I'm sure I'm wrong about some things, but it doesn't take me more than a few seconds to know that what's happening right now is complete bullshit. These vaccines are dangerous. COVID wasn't that, it's like 99.8% survival rate. So yeah, it's a crazy world. So yeah, we could, I intend to have an interview with just David at some point, because we could go on and on here about how we're the new guys in this fight for health freedom and for all truth. So, again, I appreciate David being here, and we are going to now check the interwebs and see if Ken is waiting virtually in our virtual green room, and we are going to get to this important and what I believe is going to be a very fascinating conversation with Ken McCarthy. So, all right, thanks for tuning in, and Ken will be here shortly. Well, here we are. We are in the studio, and our guest has landed virtually. He's in the virtual green room, and we're going to bring him on. And so today's guest is Ken McCarthy. David, as we spoke earlier, introduced me to Ken and his work, and digging into the work Ken has done. I am fascinated. Again, so blessed to have these amazing guests on. I can't wait to dig in. But Ken, is kind of an internet pioneer, helped innovate a lot of what you're seeing on the internet today, for better or worse. And he also, I found he wrote the book Bank Failure, Bank Runs, and the Financial System Collapses. He's been digging into truth for many years, but some of the most important, or right now what's relevant is the documentary Fauci's First Fraud, and how the parallels to the AIDS scamdemic and the COVID scamdemic are truly parallel. And so thank you so much, Ken, for giving us some of your time today and for joining us on the Truth Expedition.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for all you guys do too.
Yeah, absolutely. David?
Yeah, so Ken, we're curious. We were chatting here before you came on, and both of us have no idea how you got involved with the truth movement, specifically Brass Check TV. It's an amazing resource of a website. We were telling folks about it earlier on the call here. But I was introduced to you with internet marketing, as we chatted about at lunch a few weeks back. In 1998, I believe, is when I bought your course in internet marketing. And obviously, it had nothing to do with any kind of truth movement at all. It was all about business and using the internet to help market your business. But just curious, how did you get involved with this whole truth movement? How did Brass Check TV come to be?
Okay, so for a little historical context, so I organized and sponsored and put on the very first conference ever in the history of humanity on the idea of the web being a commercial medium. And that was in 1994. And I brought some of the then players, and it was not a big group at the time, to all sit down and say, okay, how are we going to do this, guys? How are we going to make this thing pay for itself? Because pre-1994, the web just existed, and it wasn't making any money for anybody. And some people may not be aware that when the web was originally created way back, over 30 years ago now, it was business was forbidden. Like you weren't allowed to conduct business on the internet. And then that changed, I believe, in 89. But for a couple of decades, everybody that had been doing internet things was a pure technical person that had no involvement in commercial issues whatsoever. So in 89, they announced, okay, guys, now you can use it to make money. Nothing happened. Nothing happened in 1990. Nothing happened in 1991. Nothing happened in 1992. Nothing happened in 1994. And in 1993. Then in 1994, Yahoo started, Amazon started. I put on the first conference on how we're going to make money on this thing. And one of my students, Rick Boyce, was the first person to go out and sell banner ads, internet advertising, the very first serious internet advertising ever, to major corporations. So I was part of that very small group of people that basically transformed the medium in 1994. So the following year, I did a conference on local content production and advertising on the internet, which was considered an insane topic then. I don't know, it's kind of hard to put ourselves back in that mindset, but everything was World Wide Web. You know, this is a global medium. We can reach the world. So the idea of, you know, pizza parlors and hairdressers and lawn care guys putting up websites and running ads locally, that just was not on anybody's map, right? So I put that conference on. And then I was waiting for the local small business people to start doing something with the information. And they weren't doing much with it. So I thought, okay, the better way to do that might be to start creating local content. So as a demonstration model, I became an investigative journalist into San Francisco related topics, because that's where I lived at the time. And the most obvious topic, to me at least, was a gross and apparent election fraud that occurred in 1997 related to a bond issue. In California, they put bond issues in front of the people sometimes, if it's a weird bond. Like this was a very weird deal. This was basically giving the DiBartolo family that owned the 49ers a free gift of $250 million so they could build a mall, right? So that was put before the voters of it was a San Francisco issue. So that was put as a referendum as part of the election. Nobody wanted this thing. San Francisco, despite its deserved reputation as being full of leftist loonies, also has a very hardcore established property owning class. A lot of people own their own homes in San Francisco. There are a lot of neighborhoods where there are houses and people pay taxes on those houses. And they weren't really excited about giving the DiBartolos a free gift of $250 million, which would have turned out to $500 million with the interest payments over the 30 years on the bond, right? So long story short, they were losing badly until the night of the election. And then some ballot boxes literally disappeared for 4 hours. Like nobody knew where they were. And when they finally showed up, the ballots were happily, for the purposes of the people that wanted the money, suddenly they were 95% for the ballot for the money, right? Which was enough to put the overall vote 0.1%, a simple majority, and the bond issue won. Okay. You follow this scenario, how crazy it is?
Mm-hmm.
So I said bullshit on this. A lot of people said bullshit on it. And I said, obviously, this is going to be revealed to be a scam. And nobody was revealing it. So to answer your question, this is the background. I started this big site called brasscheck.com/stadium, where every day, it was, by the way, that was the first blog. There's some news outlet in North Carolina or somewhere that claims they had the first news blog. My stadium reporting preceded that by a year. So every day I would post, here's the latest scam they're running on us. Here's the latest nonsense they're trying to sell us. Oh, by the way, you know that guy that was running the polling places down in the south side of the city? He just got indicted for fraud on another case. You know what I mean? So I was unwinding this story. And ultimately, Edward DiBartolo, who owned the 49ers, got arrested in another case for giving a former governor of Louisiana $400,000 in $100 bills in a suitcase. So that ended up blowing up the stadium deal. But until we intervened, and when I say we, it's really the royal we, it was me. That stadium was going to go forward. They were going to get the money, and they never. To this day, it's now many years later. The taxpayers of San Francisco were spared $500 million, right? So that was my my accidental introduction to the world of investigative journalism and the truth movement, right?
So election
And then
fraud.
What's that?
Election fraud. Ironically enough.
That's my next book, by the way. Actually, I have another book that I'm trying to finish, but when that book's finished, the next book will be documenting, because that everything that's happened, that particular election fraud was sort of the demo project of every conceivable thing you could do to defraud an election was used to push the victory for that stadium bond. So it's actually a textbook case, and all the things you can do to defraud an election. And I documented every one of them, not knowing that. Well, actually, I said, wow, if you can steal an election in broad daylight in a major U.S. city like this, what can't they do?
Could steal a presidential election is what they can do.
Yeah, we found out. And you know, they stole the election from, and I'm not a fan of Gore, but they also stole the election from Gore. I'm absolutely convinced he won the 2000 election.
Yeah, it goes both ways. I mean, this world is a theater, which I'm finding. So you're going through the 80s, the 90s, you're innovating the internet. You stumble in the late 90s into this, election fraud thing. So the AIDS thing is already happening. When did you decide to dig into? Was it during this current COVID scam pandemic that you decided to dig into the Fauci's first fraud, or when did that evolve?
Good question. So I just turned 64. So in my 20s, that was the 80s, right? And I was living in New York City. And the AIDS thing, that was ground zero. That just as for COVID, that's where they began to pump the hysteria, and it was scary. And people that weren't necessarily, or maybe not around then, or not of age then. And in 1998, Oprah got on her television show, which I think at that time had 40 million viewers. That's a lot. It's a big percentage of the United States, right? And she just made the blanket statement that I think she said by 2000, 1 out of 5 people in this audience will be dead from AIDS. That's the level of hysteria that was going on, being pumped by the New York Times and a lot of other news media. So I lived through that, right? And it was scary, because we didn't know. But gradually, because I was in New York City, I was getting the other side, because there were activists back then that were saying this is not the way they're presenting it. This is wildly exaggerated. They're leaving all kinds of details out, and so on. So I had that sort of in the back of my head always. So, and then I happened to meet Celia Farber. I met her sister B. I knew her father, Barry Farber, who was one of the great radio men of all time. He kind of invented talk radio back in the 70s. He was an amazing radio guy. And I met BB, and then I met Celia. And Celia Farber was one of the great journalists who wrote against the AIDS fraud in the 80s and 90s, for which she was, severely, you talk about being canceled. She was like the first person to ever be severely canceled in American history. They went after her viciously. So anyway, I was aware of Celia's work. I knew the thesis of it. And I've seen a lot of films, because there had been a lot of films made about the other side to the story. So this was all percolating in the background of my mind. And I occasionally would run things about it on Brass Check. It was just one of the many topics that we would cover. But then when COVID came along and I saw Anthony Fauci as the front man, I said, wait a minute. This is the guy, the hero of AIDS is the guy that's going to save the day in COVID. Now, my first clue that COVID was ridiculous came in January, really, of 2020. And I actually published something February 1st of 2020, because they were showing us pictures of China, and they were showing pictures of people falling down on the street, and they were showing pictures of people on hospital gurneys going into what do you call it when you have seizures, right? Seizure. And I thought, I'm no doctor, but respiratory diseases don't have anything to do with seizures. What are they showing us this for? And then the idea of the footage of people falling over spontaneously. We got to sort of rewind the tape and go back to the early 2020s. Before it came to America, they were giving us this unbelievably dramatic theatrical presentation of what was going on in China. And then with the people falling over, I'm like, well, gee, there's 11 million people in Wuhan. They have surveillance cameras on every corner. You can't sneeze without being videotaped in Wuhan. How many people just faint every day in Wuhan out of a population of 11 million? I mean, people faint. It happens. So if you've got cameras on everybody 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it's 11 million people, you will find people falling over in the street on that footage. So what they did was they just took that footage. Who knows why the guy fell over? Maybe, who knows? Who knows what it was, right? But they presented
who knows when it was?
All right. Well, that's another point. Maybe they had to go back to 1997 to find that footage. But they found. Good point, Dave. See, David's a magician, and he knows all the tricks. About how people can redirect people's attention and fool you. But in any event, that was the word of the Chinese Communist government. Footage of somebody having a seizure and footage of a guy falling down in the street. That was the total evidence that there was an outbreak of some deadly, never before seen pandemic. Now, it didn't take long for me to learn that Wuhan has 11 million people and that it's the most polluted city in the world, maybe the most polluted city in the history of humanity. And the guys all smoke, especially the older guys. So you've got a population of people that have poor health care, terrible air pollution. They're all smokers. Well, of course you're going to have horrible respiratory situations. Then they repeated the story, and so they showed it to us in China, and where we were all like sitting back, taking it in, going, "Boy, I'm sure glad I'm not Chinese. I'm sure glad I don't live in China because that looks crazy." So then they brought the act to Italy. So now I'm half Italian, so I can say this: Italians are almost white. They're almost white people, right? And so they showed Italy, and it's like, oh my God, it's happening to Italy, so it can happen to people like us, Now, what they didn't tell us about Italy is that part of Italy is the most polluted part of all of Europe. It's got air pollution because there's a lot of factories up there. We think of Italy as everybody sitting around drinking Chianti and eating pizza, and spaghetti. No, they're making, cars, right? Fiats and all these amazing cars. They all come out of the north of Italy. So the northern Italy is a valley, very heavily polluted, especially in the winter. It's got the oldest demographic of all of Europe. People still smoke, and it's one of the few places in Europe where they gutted the medical system. Other countries like Germany, they have like 8 hospital beds per 10,000 people. Italy is following the American model, which is they had 2 hospital beds per 10,000 people. So every year, if you just did a little Google search, you would see every year you had hospitals going into complete chaos when all the old folks were showing up during air pollution season with severe respiratory problems. And I actually had this experience myself. I caught a stomach flu in New York City, and it hit me strong. And I was in good shape at the time, really athletic, and I could barely walk. And it happened fast. I thought maybe I'm having a heart attack. So I went to a good private New York hospital. I spent 8 hours, and this wasn't even during a flu season or a pandemic or anything. I spent 8 hours in the waiting room. 8 hours total before I saw a doctor. 4 in the waiting room, 4 on a gurney in the hallway. All right, that's business as usual for a New York City hospital, right? So as the story evolved, okay, first we're seeing all the craziness in China, then we're seeing the misrepresentation of average flu season in northern Italy, then we're seeing the representation of the completely dysfunctional New York City hospital. So I wasn't buying it at all. So I said, somebody's got to do a deep dive into Fauci's nefarious dealings in AIDS. And as I did that, because I already had the template in my brain from decades of being aware, in a general sense of what a fraud he was. I did the deep dive, right? And as I did the deep dive, I realized, oh my God, they're running the same exact playbook for COVID that they stumble on for AIDS. It is exactly the same. What are we talking about? Mystery virus, never before seen in human history, completely unprecedented. Okay, bullshit on COVID, because it's just a COVID virus. I mean, it's just a coronavirus, of which we've had gazillions of them, right? So that was baloney. What was the next part of the AIDS playbook? Oh, if you get this thing, you're a goner. Like, there's no hope. You get it, you might as well, book a room at the mortuary because you're headed there. Okay, they were selling that same nonsense with COVID. So mystery illness came out of the blue, completely fatal. Oh, and you'll die a miserable death, right? You'll be miserable, right? Okay. What other nonsense did they sell us?
AZT.
Oh no! Wait, here's another important one. That you can have this virus, not have any symptoms at all, not be sick in the slightest, and just walking down the street, you leave a trail of death that's going to kill innocent people. Okay, they said the same thing about with AIDS, right? Just having AIDS, just being in the same room as somebody with AIDS, it would somehow jump over through the air and into your body, grab you by the throat, and you're a goner. Okay, well, that was what they were selling us with COVID, right? And then now let's get to the testing. So this is really important. This is so fundamental. Now AIDS is a real thing. The total catastrophic collapse of the immune system does happen to certain people, but it happens under very particular circumstances. It happens to intravenous drug users. Why? Well, if you're taking substances of unknown pedigree and injecting them into your bloodstream 6 to 10 times a day, every day of the week, do you think it might have an impact on your immune system? Yes, it does. So there were AIDS-like syndromes being reported 100 years ago from the first generation of intravenous drug users. All right. Who else would get AIDS? Hemophiliacs. Now, hemophiliacs by necessity have to go through all kinds of injections, all kinds of drug regimes, all kinds of stuff, blood transfusion. They're exposed to a lot of toxic material just to stay alive. Okay. That's why a certain small percentage of hemophiliacs might develop an AIDS syndrome, right? An AIDS-like syndrome. And then the third category of people that got AIDS were male homosexuals. Got nothing against anybody's sexual preference, each to his own, as long as you're an adult. Okay. Now, within that large category of people, there was a small category of people that every population has. Christians have it, conservatives have it, Martians have it. Everybody's got a small segment of their population that overdoes it, right? Yeah. They don't just go out for dinner and have a few drinks, okay? They go out every night of the week and they're snorting speed and they're snorting coke and they're drinking and they're smoking. And in the case of a very small percentage of the male homosexual population in the big cities, they would also be taking a drug called poppers, which heterosexuals don't take. Poppers is a medical thing. If someone's having a heart attack, you break it, they inhale it, and it opens up every blood vessel in the body.
Yeah, it's a nitrate, amyl nitrate. It's a vasodilator, so it's going to open up. And I think when it comes to sexual things, if you can imagine dilating a certain
and part of the body,
right? Yeah. And it also doesn't it make introduction of something into a part of a body more comfortable?
Yeah, so we need to go too far there. But those who have imagination, I think those who have imaginations, can imagine this.
Sorry,
so that's why
folks.
it was so That's why that drug was so popular. Now, I'm going to talk about how popular it was in a second, but I want to talk about the danger of this drug. And it was widely known, and it was in a stack of scientific papers. It was not a mystery to anybody pre-AIDS that particular substance might save a life, but you sure didn't want to do it a lot because it was a carcinogen and it was a mutagen. All right. Now, so how often were a small percentage of that population indulging in poppers? Here would be a typical night. They'd go out with a pocket full of them, and all night long, they'd be breaking and sniffing them on the dance floor. Poppers were so popular that the bars in the nightclubs, the gay nightclubs, would have, they'd have Johnny Walker and they'd have, Miller beer or whatever, and they'd have a line of poppers. Okay. Some clubs even put poppers into spray machines and sprayed the popper fumes over the dance floor.
Wow.
Crazy.
Yeah. And then we won't get too graphic, but then and then part of this scene for a small percentage would be, hey, I'm going to have sex with 5 or 10 different guys tonight, because I'm on speed and I'm in my 20s and I have the energy to do it. And as you know, the virtue of heterosexuality is you have men and women, right? Men in general are ready to go and are a little bit reckless and don't think too much about the issue. Women are very circumspect and think about it very carefully in general. Am I correct?
I agree.
I mean,
yep, you're right.
So that's a good system, especially when you're dealing with something so volatile as, potential pregnancy or potential sexual transmitted diseases, and just the chaos that occurs when people are get involved sexually. So it's good to have that kind of balance, right? So when you remove the moderating factor and now you just have guys, it can get out of hand. And that's what happens for a certain small percentage of this particular population. And they would ask some of these guys, how many sexual partners did you have this year? And they go, couple of, over 1,000. I mean, I can't even wrap my mind around where you would even find the time. But
yeah,
but it was possible in those days to go to a club and just go guy after guy after guy. Now, the first people that came down with this disease were male hustlers. All right, there are female prostitutes. Well, there were actually male prostitutes too, and there are. And these guys would hang around these clubs and have sex with, a dozen or more guys every night. That was their job, and they were taking all kinds of drugs and they were doing all kinds of poppers. And now, so long story short, is it a surprise that this small segment of the male homosexual population suffered catastrophic immune system collapse? I mean, they weren't eating, they were up all night, they were taking drugs. Oh, the other thing is they were contracting lots of sexually transmitted diseases, like 3 or 4 or 5 times a year, different ones. And what were they doing to combat that? Well, they were taking antibiotics. We all know antibiotics are a wonderful thing, but if you are taking too many of them, they will actually degrade your immune system. So these guys were catching a lot of diseases and then taking long treatments of antibiotics, drinking all night, taking drugs, doing poppers, staying up late. I mean, all this craziness. Again, small percentage of a larger population. And then it got to the point where a certain part of this population was taking antibiotics prophylactically. So they would, take a line of speed, shoot back a shot of Johnny Walker, and then take their antibiotics and head off to the club. Yeah. I mean, this is a recipe for destroying the human immune system. So these are the guys, these are the people, intravenous drug users, some hemophiliacs, and this small population of the fast lane gay lifestyle who were getting the real AIDS. And that disease was real. I mean, it's not even a disease, it's a syndrome. Your whole immune system breaks down. And the way the immune system broke down for the original generation of AIDS, they call them victims, but I mean, kind of self-induced victimhood. We'll call them victims though. There were 2 diseases. One was Kaposi sarcoma. The other was fungal growth in the lungs. Kaposi sarcoma is a disease of the skin that old Mediterranean guys get. They're 80 years old. They've been out in the sun their whole life, and they start getting, cancerous black blotches on their skin. Now suddenly young men were getting this, but where were they getting it? In their nasal passages and in their throats.
Yeah,
I wonder
drugs.
why.
Yeah.
Do you think inhaling a carcinogen 10 times a night, every night of the week, could potentially, it's just that. And what was the other disease that was the original AIDS? Um, Fungal growth in the lungs. Again, same issue, right? If you're inhaling a carcinogen frequently, you might hurt your lungs, right? So what they did was they said, okay, these two completely different diseases, which have been in existence forever, they weren't new diseases, were caused by a virus, right? Not by the misuse of drugs or the misuse of your body, but by this mystery virus, which we now need to spend millions and billions of dollars researching. And by the way, they have spent in real cash over $500 billion researching AIDS since the 1980s. That's $500 billion. Okay, so part of this scam was, and hope am I going on too long? Is
No,
this
no.
It's amazing.
I think I'd like to also mention too, like they were saying it was pandemic in Africa too, but it was malnutrition, because malnutrition and aseptic technique with water and such like that, it's going to cause your immune system to fail as well. So, they're saying it started in Africa, but all these things. And I think what you're leading to is HIV does not cause AIDS.
right? Well, bottom line, there are people who've had a positive HIV test who have never gotten AIDS. There are people that have never tested positive for HIV who have gotten raging cases of AIDS. So the whole HIV equals AIDS equals miserable death was a lie. So thank you for bringing us to a fundamental there, because that everybody needs to understand that. Everybody needs to understand that. And then so taking this to COVID for a second, the other part of the playbook that they used for AIDS that they then revived for COVID was testing. Everybody must get tested. Now, in my generation, literally, people before they had, you'd meet somebody you liked, and you'd start to get serious, and you'd both go get an AIDS, even though you were heterosexual and didn't go to gay nightclubs and snort poppers and all this, or didn't take intravenous drugs. You get an AIDS test. Some girls wanted, and it was sort of like considered a gallant thing to do in the 80s in the New York City. Make sure you don't have AIDS. You didn't catch it. Because the model was, okay, you had sex with somebody once, right? I know you did.
Yeah.
Now, who did she have sex with? Do you know? And who did those people have sex with? And and suddenly, excuse me.
Yeah, you're 1 degree of separation from having AIDS.
Yeah. Right. And so they put this into everybody's mind. So it was common for even heterosexual people who had relatively normal lives to get AIDS tests. And I'll tell you what, when I was 40, I went to get life insurance. And in order to get life insurance, my wife and I had to get AIDS tests to qualify for life insurance. So they were making and every male homosexual and in New York who was responsible, they were getting the AIDS test, and I'll talk about that in a second. They were all getting the AIDS test repeatedly, right? So that became the mantra: get tested. Sound familiar, right?
A little bit.
Everybody needs to get tested frequently, right? So here's the scam there. There's no such thing as an AIDS test, right? It really was a test for HIV, the virus that causes AIDS, right? But it wasn't even a test for HIV, because you can't, as Carrie Mullis, who's won the Nobel Prize for chemistry, said, there is no way to take a blood sample and look through a super microscope and see HIV swimming around. What they were doing, the test was a test for the presence of genetic artifacts that may or may not have indicated of the one-time presence of a thing that may or may not have been HIV. And by the time all the smoke cleared, and this is now established science, there were over 100 ways to trigger a positive HIV test that had nothing to do with being sick or ill or anything. I mean, it could be maybe antihistamines. I mean, I don't know what the things that were triggering it were. So in other words, they were giving all these people a test that was completely bogus and unreliable. So bogus and unreliable that the person that developed the original technology, coincidentally Carrie Mullis, said, This technology, PCR, should never, ever, ever be used as a diagnostic technique. It is a genetic material amplification technique. That's what it was, and that's what I created it for. That's what it does. It doesn't detect anything. And you can literally, and some, but pre-COVID, there was this great article. Some group of public health people went on the subways of New York and took swabs of the seats and the poles and everything. They literally found every disease known to man, including bubonic plague and a whole bunch of viruses and bacteria. They didn't even know what it was. Okay. We're swimming in this stuff all the time, right? That's the reality. And you can take, but people aren't dying like, not dropping, right? Why? Because we have immune systems that are functional and we just bat it off. If the immune system worked the way Fauci and the frauds say it does, there would be no human beings on the planet left, and there wouldn't be even any mammals or reptiles. We all would have transmitted diseases to each other and all died. So it's not the presence of some kind of a virus or bacteria is not the sole determining factor of whether somebody's going to get sick or not, right? But with PCR, you could take a piece of absolutely ineffectual genetic material that indicates the presence of a disease and amplify it to the point where now it appears to be a big deal. And that's what PCR is. PCR was invented because when you're doing genetic research, you had to grow material. You had to grow biological material. That takes time. PCR would allow you to double and double and double and double rapidly so that you had enough genetic material to actually do your work, your genetic investigations on. So using it as a diagnostic, that was the fraud way back in the 80s. That should have been shut down. And the inventor of the technology, who coincidentally won a Nobel Prize for it, said that publicly over and over and over again. What are you guys doing? You should not be using this as a diagnostic. It has nothing to do with diagnostic. It's an amplifier, and you can amplify, you can find and amplify any pathogen in the universe if you just run enough cycles of it through the PCR process.
Yeah, so Ken, didn't Mullis famously challenge Fauci to a debate? He's famous for calling Fauci a fraud, a moron, said he knows nothing about anything. I mean, so Mullis died just before
He died the summer of 2020.
Yeah.
And here's the thing, of pneumonia. Now, here's the scary thing. If you want to kill somebody and get away with it, I'm not saying this happened, but if you want to kill somebody, wait till they check into a hospital.
No doubt. And
you'll have no problem making that person disappear. I hope that's not what happened to him.
Yeah.
And here's another interesting, just historic thing. Everybody knows the Muppets, right?
Yeah.
And most people know Jim Henson invented the Muppets. He's a puppeteer. And some people know that he sold the Muppets to Disney for $200 million. Money well earned, by the way. He developed some kind of pneumonia, went into a fancy private New York hospital and died. And they said, oh, well, this thing had some unusual symptoms. And at the time, they were attributing it to, what happens is hospitals, I mean, I hate to burst anybody's bubble, but most of them are filthy and most of them are unsanitary and most of them have so many pathogens floating around them that you want to get out of a hospital as soon as you can. A lot of people catch infections in hospitals and die. And so the hospital obviously didn't want to cop to that. So they went on and on about, this was the most unusual. We're gonna have thousands of researchers trying to figure out the nature of this particular pneumonia. But they didn't shut the world down for it, did they? So here's a man with the highest of all possible profiles who went in healthy and came out in a body bag because of a pneumonia that had some unusual features. Well, what kicked off the COVID thing? Some anonymous dude dies in a Chinese hospital in Wuhan of pneumonia that had a few unusual features. Why did that cause the entire world to go into a panic? when Jim Henson died and nobody lost a day's sleep over. You know what I mean? The whole thing never added up from day one, right? So anyway, the next part of their playbook was testing. We're going to test everybody, and by God, we're going to find a lot of COVID, and we're going to say that even if you have no symptoms at all, you don't have the slightest elevation of temperature, you don't have a runny nose, you haven't even sneezed, but if you've got that positive test, that unreliable positive test, if you got that positive test, you're an active case. You're an active infection, right? I mean, I'm probably preaching to the choir. You guys already know this, but this is the same game they ran with AIDS, and it was run by the same guy, and nobody noticed. Well,
Incredible.
somebody noticed. Robert F. Kennedy noticed, and he started writing about it around the same time I did. He started writing about it in April of 2020. And I started putting out little videos in April of 2020. And then by August of 2020, I assembled all these little videos into a full film called Fauci's First Fraud, which you can see at faucisfirstfraud.com. And that came out in August of 2020. Then in March of 2021, I heard through the grapevine, thank God I heard it, that Kennedy was working on a book on Fauci. I thought, hallelujah, this is great. So I wrote a real letter to Kennedy praying that it would get through to all his handlers and get to him and say, you know, Mr. Kennedy, I've got a stack of research on Anthony Fauci. You can have it all, you know. And by God, he called me, and I shared everything I had with him in November. And I participated in that book as being like a copy editor, a proofreader, a fact checker. And then he used the film quite a bit. The film is cited, I think, 28 times in his book. One chapter, it's 10% of all the citations of a single chapter. So it became from the material that I provided him, and Celia Farber, coincidentally, the woman I referred to earlier, also was talking with him, unbeknownst to me, you know, because it was a big enterprise to put that book out. But anyway, between Celia and me, he completely changed the course of the book. And if you look at that book, the center of the book is, I think, 5 chapters discussing the Fauci AIDS history. And that came from me and Celia. And then when it was time for the book to launch, I casually mentioned or said, hey, you've got a launch plan, right? You know? And this book came out from CDC, not CDC, CHD, which is the Kennedy the charity that Kennedy co-founded with
Children's Health Defense. Yeah, Children's Health Defense.
Yeah. So they told me what their plan was for launching it, and you know, I'm a marketer at heart. That's what I do. And I was like, oh my God, this is the worst launch plan I've ever. Their launch plan was to have a 10-day countdown, and then announce that the book was available, and then go on to their next project, whatever that might be. Like, just totally abandon the book. Like, do the countdown. Hey, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming, it's here. And I said, guys, you don't understand. This book is like the silver bullet. Like, this is the magic bullet. Like, it's the right book at the right time about the right guy, written by the right guy. And you've got the million-person CHD list, plus all your allies, which adds up to, you know, another 15 million. We can make this a bestseller. And they didn't believe it. And I was emphatic. And I got in touch with the publisher, Tony Lyons, and he had obviously a dog in the fight. He wanted to sell a lot of books, and he had printed 200,000, which is a lot for a first run. And he was hoping that within a year he could sell out those 200,000. But you know, publishing is very speculative, and you know, there's pretty good margin, you know, especially if you have relationship with printers and so on. You can print those books really cheap, so you don't expect to sell the 200,000, but you want to have them just in case, you know. Well, I got involved in marketing very energetically and very aggressively. And I made myself a very unpopular person among the CHD staff, because I just wouldn't accept their level of non-activity in the promotion of the book. But they for a while, they did listen. And while they were listening, we were the #1 book on Amazon nonfiction, like, consistently. And they finally just had enough of me and, you know, booted me. And a week later, the book fell off the bestsellers list and never recovered. So I was very involved in the success of that book. Punchline, It didn't sell 200,000 copies. It sold 1 million copies in the first 8 weeks, in all mediums: audio, hardcover, Kindle. And I believe it broke the back of Tony Fauci's reputation. I think if if you go back and read the newspapers and stuff, he was still, some people were sick of him, but generally he was considered a capable, heroic guy doing his best. I think once that book came out, people finally got the clue. No, there's something else going on here, and it's not good. And its name is Tony Fauci, So,
And can it be specific? You're talking about the real Anthony Fauci book,
the real Anthony Fauci, the big black book that Bobby Kennedy came with. That you guys got to, if everybody it's hard because we're catapulting ourselves down into the future, and we can barely keep track of what happened last week, let alone a couple of years ago. But if you look at the trajectory of this thing, that was I believe, and of course I'm biased because I was involved in it, but I believe that was a huge turning point. The success of that book. Now, now about that book, it was not reviewed by the New York Times, not even mentioned by the New York Times, not reviewed by anybody. Yeah, normally, if a book comes out like, what is it, 50 Shades of Grey or whatever that thing was, a totally trash book, but because it was selling a lot of copies, that alone became a story, and the media poured into it, and they wanted to know the details and the facts, and and that made it even a bigger bestseller. But the news media relentlessly ignored the book. They did not mention it. They didn't review it. They showed no curiosity about it. We were not allowed to advertise it on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube. The New York Times allowed one ad, and they made us pull the quote from, I'm drawing a blank on the guy's name. This is the guy credited with the discovery of the AIDS virus. Which
Robert Gallo.
No, that's the American con artist who claimed to have discovered it.
Montagnier? Luc Montagnier? Is that who you're talking about?
Luc Montagnier. So Luc Montagnier said something like, "This is the most important book of our time," right? Luc Montagnier, Nobel Prize winner. The New York Times would only run the ad for Kennedy's book once, and they would only run it if we agreed to pull that quote from the ad. This is the stacked deck we were dealing with. Yet we managed to sell over 1 million copies. Why? It was the right book at the right time on the right topic, about the right person, by the right person. And Kennedy's group had 1 million person mailing list. And one of my jobs was to just crack the whip and say, "Mail again." And they're like, "We already mailed." I said, "Mail again." And I made myself really unpopular. They hate me. The staff hates me, which is fine. I don't care. But that was my job, basically, which was just to relentlessly, and I tried to be diplomatic, but I ended up becoming obnoxious. Mail again, mail, and it was so obvious. And David would appreciate this, and if you have some marketing background, you'd appreciate it. If you don't advertise, people don't know what you got. I know this is a radical notion, And the other notion, we're giving some business advice to everybody, because maybe there's somebody out there starting a business or they're struggling in their business. You can't just advertise once. You can't just say, "Hey, I'm open, I'm done," right? You got to advertise relentlessly, right? The other side does it, and that's why they were able to sell us on this scam, So that's the story of how a marketing guy became a truth movement person, and got involved in producing this book and the film related to it.
Hey, Ken, you alluded to a little bit earlier that you have another book coming out. Now, when we chatted at lunch a few weeks back, you mentioned a book with Nicole. I'll just leave it at that. Can you share anything more on that?
I do, and it's, I often underestimate how hard things are, and I don't have the right timetable. I thought I'd be done long ago. This book is called "What the Nurses Saw." And in, having had my own experience in a New York City hospital, and had other experiences, like I once visited a friend's daughter in a public hospital in New York City. And I mean, wow, horror, absolute horror at how this place was being run. Couldn't have been worse, right? So I knew that when when people were talking about when I knew that all the deaths were taking place in hospitals run by New York City, which is how it worked, by the way, I knew something was very seriously wrong. I'm not very good with Slavic names. I just have trouble. Siratek, I finally nailed that one down. But there's another nurse, Erin.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone knows what I mean, Erin, just wonderful human being. And I met her very early on, and I interviewed her in great depth. So I did that in the summer of 2020. I also interviewed a PhD nursing educator in the UK who had 40 years of nursing experience, including during the AIDS time. And so I had these two extended interviews that were on my database, in my files. And I realized, wow, somebody's eventually going to write about how bad these hospitals were, right? They're going to write about how the hospitals were actually killing people, right? Someone's going to do this, right? Now, Erin wrote a book, thank God, and it came out very early. Nicole's writing a book about how she was, witch hunt against her. So that's good. But other than that, there are no books about the mayhem and murder that took place in hospitals under the cover of COVID. So that's what this book is. And so I've fleshed it out with many more contemporary interviews from 2023. And so now I'm just going through it's like, this is the hard part of, editing stuff and, making it coherent and so on. So that's what it's going to be. And other than Erin's book and other than Nicole's book, as far as I know, it's going to be the only thing that you can hold in your hand. There's a lot of web stuff that you can go to and get some hints, but there's no physical book where you can just read the accounts of how they were just flat out killing people in the hospitals. And I'm using, I've thought carefully about the word killing and the word murder. But if you do something, if you try something and it kills a patient, and let's say it's an emergency, right? And you've been told that this disease has never been seen in the history of man, and it's unlike all other diseases, and therefore we have these new protocols that you must follow. And the protocols involved, you're not allowed to give the patient any anti-inflammatories. Now, we all know about ivermectin and all this stuff, right? But there was a more fundamental thing going on. They would not give these patients anti-inflammatories, and they would not give these patients steroids, okay? In the history of medicine, every time somebody's got a serious respiratory problem with inflammation, you give them anti-inflammatories. I think even a 5-year-old can understand that one. And then steroids have another positive effect that help the body deal with the emergency of hyper. I wanted to say hyperinflation. I'm thinking about my book on banking.
Hypoxia.
No, hypoxia. That's a whole nother issue. Like a lot of the places where people were, first of all, I don't want to go too deep down in that, but one of the places where people were appearing with hypoxia were people living in the South Bronx neighborhood. Well, in their wisdom, and I'm being sarcastic here, they put a literal interstate highway over the South Bronx on an elevated highway, right? And this is like a interstate highway, and there's always a traffic. I guarantee if we go there right now, there's a traffic jam. We go there 5 hours from now, there'll be a traffic jam. If we go there at midnight, there'll be a traffic jam. So basically, you have all these, and a lot of it's trucks. Basically, you have hundreds of diesel trucks sitting on this elevated highway, raining diesel fumes down on a neighborhood pretty much 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And are we surprised there's a lot of respiratory problems in that neighborhood, right? So basically what would happen is people would, after hearing the news, oh my God, there's a virus and it's going to kill you and there's no hope. So people that had garden variety respiratory problems now were suggestion, the power of suggestion. And David, our expert magician, knows how potent the power of suggestion is. So if we take, shortness of breath and put a frame around it and say, this is COVID and you're on the road to death, people who otherwise would have just stayed home and shaken it off went to the hospital. When they showed up in the hospital, they were given the COVID test. And this gets even crazier. Instead of using the instant test, which was bogus, let's remember these tests are bogus. They mean and say nothing. They're useless. In fact, there's a credentialed professor at the University of San Francisco in California who's telling people right now, I'm not getting a COVID test. You shouldn't get a COVID test. Don't have anything to do with these COVID tests, right? But in any event, someone would come in with asthma, which is a common problem in the South Bronx, any number of things that could cause respiratory problems, which if you have respiratory problems, you're going to have hypoxia because respiratory is your distribution of oxygen. And so if your respiratory system is challenged, you're not going to be distributing oxygen very well in your body, and it's going to show up in a test, right? So anybody that came into that hospital that had any kind of a problem, they would give them a COVID test. But they would give them the 5-day test. So they would say, well, you probably have COVID, so we're going to admit you as we wait for the results of the test. And then, of course, miraculously, everybody that took the test had COVID. And then the cash register would ring. And one of the ways they rang the cash register, and this is what the book is about, and this is why I call it murder, is they put everybody on event in certain hospitals. They didn't do this if you were a millionaire or a billionaire or in a hospital that wasn't run by maniacs, they wouldn't do it. But in these public hospitals in New York City, which had the highest, I don't know what the death rates are now, but at a certain point, the New York City hospitals had like 20 times the death rate from COVID of any other part of the world. Not 20% more, 20 times more, because anybody that walked in the door with virtually any problem was immediately called a COVID case. And as soon as event was available, they were put on it. Now, the reason I say as soon as event was available, what Aaron told me and what's in the book is somebody would die, they'd clean the vent up, and they'd put another person on it immediately. Yeah. This is not normal medicine.
No, it isn't, Ken. So I'm a respiratory therapist, actually. I worked.
Oh my God! You know the whole deal.
I worked in a COVID unit. I was interviewed by Nicole. I saw this all happening. They were intubating patients when they were requiring 3 liters of oxygen via a nasal cannula. That's basically at a point which you don't really even need oxygen. Never in the history of medicine will you do this. You don't early intubate ever, and they were doing it. And one thing led to another with me. I was watching people, for instance, a 90-year-old lady would come in with a GI bleed, no respiratory symptoms. She would just so happen to test positive for COVID and then get labeled as a COVID death when she would bleed to death from something totally unrelated. I saw all of this stuff happening. You're absolutely right.
Wow. Maybe I could interview you for the book, because we don't have a respiratory therapist.
Yeah, I've famously been called. I called out the hospital murder apparently, but I don't like to call it murder. The doctors I was working with, Ken, they were otherwise good people. None of it was intentional homicide. But I believe that when you do the same thing over and over and over and over again, and everyone's dying over and over and over again, and you've got other therapies you can try that you're not willing to try, and you can continue with this deadly protocol, there's a point at which it becomes some degree of homicide.
Yeah, and the emphasis was put on ivermectin and the other one, hydrochloric, whatever it's called,
hydroxy. Yeah.
Yeah, but there were basic things that could have been done, like Advil,
vitamin D.
Vitamin D. But I'm going to even say vitamin D is way out there.
Yeah.
But nobody in the hospital world thinks Advil or Tylenol is some bizarro treatment for inflammation. Right?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. It's insane. It's everything that has happened is just, it's crazy.
Where I call it murder is. And I have a lot of sympathy for the nurses and the doctors, because they were brainwashed as well. They were told there was a virus of never before seen in human history, completely fatal. You might get it yourself. That was the other thing, right? You might get it too. So a lot of, especially less experienced people, which by the way is what these hospitals were filled with when they went out and recruited contract nurses and this is in the interview with Aaron, um, they did not ask for nurses with ICU experience. Okay. They just said, do you have a nursing degree? And that included people that had literally just gotten their degree and had no, other than their school experience, had no clinical experience at all, were put in ICUs. So here's where the murder is. Whoever set that system up, those people are stone cold murderers, because they knew. I mean, and it's not the nurses, not the doctors, because everybody can get fooled. Everybody can get panicked. I get it. I could have, I always say, what would I have done? Well, imagine, I don't know what I would have done. I like to think I would have said, hey, I'm out of here.
That's what I did. I believe you would have done the same thing. You would have seen enough of it and just tried to fight back and push against the early intubation and try to get vitamin D, try to get ivermectin. And then you hit a point where you're just like, excuse my French, but you're like, fuck this. I cannot watch this any longer.
Yeah. I mean, what's your option? But I'm not gonna judge the people who are on the front line, because but I do judge the people that put them in that situation. And that would be the hospital administrators. That would be the CFO of whoever owned the hospital in the first place. And that would absolutely be the federal bureaucrats that promulgated all these protocols and said, so at some point, and this requires true investigative journalism, and I'm hoping somebody, because I'm not an investigative journalist, I'm a business guy who's doing other, this is not what I do, and I certainly don't have, a big news organization funding my work, right? So what needs to be done would be a large enterprise requiring a lot of serious people full-time with a lot of money, which would ask the basic question, who came up with this system? Because it wasn't just, and I could almost even accept this. They went down the wrong track cognitively, intellectually. They thought it was an unknown disease. They came up with their best way to treat it. They promulgated that method. They told everybody, guys, try this. I could almost accept that as human error. But there's the other piece. They had forced those protocols with an iron fist, and anybody that dared question them was disciplined, was taken out of the ICU, or was flat out fired. And in Nicole's case, it wasn't enough to fire her. They chased her down and sent a digital, and not just a digital mob, but a real life mob after her, to the point where she had strange men showing up at her home while she was home alone with her kids.
Yeah. So Ken, are you familiar with Scott Schara?
I know Scott. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So dig into his most recent work. He's got a series coming out about, the number one cause of death in the country right now is hospital murder. And he's traced this all back to, Obamacare. And this was all put into place, many years ago.
I think so. I mean, the reality is people die. People who shouldn't die in hospitals. That's always been a reality. I mean, it just happens. It happens. Lack of sanitation, error, wrong drugs. Just things happen. We're mortal flesh, and we're not going to live forever, and something's going to kill us. And being involved in the medical system, you're not only at risk from whatever your problem is, you're also, in my opinion, you're also at risk from the medical system itself, right? So that's always been a reality. But yeah, I think Scott's really onto something, because they did change the game during the Obama era, and they started to normalize the idea of, I don't know, people need to go. People that are dying need to go faster,
Yeah.
And that accelerated. And the fellow that I interviewed in England, and I'm sorry I'm drawing a blank on his name, but again, 40 years of experience as a nurse and a PhD and a nurse educator. And he said that their system, which is a little different than ours, made the very conscious decision: we got to get rid of a lot of old people. Because you may know this, that long before, I think even before COVID appeared, this particular drug, I can't remember the name of it.
Midazolam?
Yeah, exactly.
Versed. Yeah, that's the Michael Jackson drug.
Yeah, well, suddenly, container loads of this stuff were appearing in all of the UK hospitals. And when older people came in with respiratory problems during the COVID panic, they were put on heavy duty doses of this. And that's sort of I forget what the drugs they put Scott's daughter on, but they
that
didn't give
and others. Yep.
yeah, but
Morphine.
they were basically slowly killing her. I mean,
They
killing
killed
her.
her. They killed her. That was
Yeah.
murder. In my
Yeah.
in my mind, that was intentional murder. Those doctors need to be held accountable and put in prison. And hopefully, I think the lawsuit starts next in November, and everyone needs to follow that closely and support Scott. These people that could set a precedent.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that wasn't even, they didn't put her on a vent. They were trying to. They didn't give her remdesivir.
They put an illegal do not resuscitate on her, and Scott was on an iPad screaming at them to please save his daughter, and they all stood there. They actually walked out of the room and let her die. It pisses me off. I mean, it's murder.
You know what I think? By the way, I think today is either his daughter's birthday or the day that she died. I can't remember which.
Damn, you might be right.
This coincidentally is a very important day. So there's cases like that, and those cases are ongoing. I mean, I'm sure that's happening in a hospital somewhere right now. And then there's the issue of denying people therapies that work. And again, maybe in the first couple of weeks, all right, it's panic time. But as the months and months rolled on, and they could see that these therapies the therapies they were using not only weren't helping, they were actively injuring people and killing them, and then denying people common sense. And again, we won't even get into the vitamin D or the vitamin C. We'll even leave that aside. They wouldn't let these folks take ibuprofen. They wouldn't give them steroids. These are things that you give people if they've got an inflammation process.
Oh, yeah. I tell you, historically, absolutely, it was a disease of inflammation of the lungs. You give steroids. You give that stuff, but no, not for this. Everything changed.
I mean, it would be like, okay, so, people are breaking their legs in a way we've never seen before. So here's the treatment. No, you don't reset the bone. No, don't do that. Don't do that. Don't give them painkillers. Don't do that. Don't put it in a cast. Don't do that. Here's this silk cloth. Just sort of wrap it around their forehead, and stick a pipe down their throat. And that's gonna, this is how crazy it was.
Yeah.
From a medical point of view.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's the book that I hope sees the light of day.
That's awesome. I'd like to talk to you more about that, Ken. We are getting close to running out of time here, but I did want to at least wrap in. So it's Fauci's First Fraud. You got to see the book, brasscheck.com. But I want to talk about, when I was doing some pre-interview prep, about the parallels between, so I would say ACT was the remdesivir is the,
yeah.
and then what about
AZT.
peptide P? When you look at the movie Dallas Buyers Club with Matthew McConaughey, he was taking the AZT, getting sick as hell, and then he found, so peptide T would be your ivermectin or your hydroxychloroquine.
Oh yeah, there were probably, and I'm not up on it, but there were probably things that could arrest the AIDS process. In other words, you've gone this far, and it's like, okay, first law, stop the bleeding, right? So there may have been substances that could have just stopped the disease process. I honestly don't know what they are, but I know one thing for sure, it wasn't AZT. And so yeah, that part of the whole AIDS scam was taking a drug that had been literally banned for human use and changing its classification and telling all these people that had positive HIV tests, many of them symptomless, many of them would never have had any, they might have, had some other problem, but they didn't have an AIDS problem. And telling all those people take AZT, and the AZT killed them.
Yeah, so they were giving like huge doses of AZT, 1,500 milligrams or something, and so all these people are dying. Then they backed the dose off to like 500, and they were living longer, so then they said it was the AZT making them live longer when it was actually what was killing them. It's such a bizarre freak show.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And not only that, but the symptoms of AZT poisoning. And remember, AZT is so toxic that it was prohibited for you weren't even allowed to test it on human beings. So you couldn't even have a clinical trial on it. It was banned for human use because it was known to be such a devastating toxin. And what were the symptoms of AZT poisoning? Everything that you would associate with AIDS, right? So people were absolutely healthy people were terrorized into getting an HIV test. They would get a positive test, even though they had no symptoms. But of course, in the back of their mind, they're like, well, I had sex with this guy, and who knows who he had sex with. So that logic, that was it. So they were all terrorized. They were told they had HIV. They were told HIV means death and a miserable death. Oh, and by the way, a death that's your fault. And your only way out is the magic drug AZT. And in my film, they had demonstrations. Give us the AZT. I can't remember what the exact chant was, but they were literally in the streets. They weaponized the gay rights community to get out in the street. See, that community already existed. They were already fighting for certain civil rights or whatever, and that they already existed. And so what the drug companies and Fauci did was they infiltrated ACT UP, this group ACT UP, took it over and made it into a drug marketing scheme. And AZT and the promotion of AZT became ACT UP's job number one. And by the way, any gay activists who went to the ACT UP meetings, and I have a whole interview with some of them, who said, we don't think this is a good idea. They were shouted down and told never to come back and threatened. And one person said, yeah, someone asked him, well, why did you stop speaking out? He goes, my life was threatened. And he goes, well, I guess that's a pretty good reason to stop speaking out. So, the AZ, so they used a bogus, first they used the media. This is the key thing. And amazingly enough, it was the New York Times that sold the AIDS scam. They were absolutely, remove the New York Times from that scenario, and AIDS never would have been a thing. So just as the New York Times is absolutely responsible for the AIDS scam, they're absolutely responsible for the COVID scam. So first came the media and the drama, and then the panic, and then the long-term terror as we waited for the cure. Then they announced the cure. In the case of COVID, it was mRNA injections, which have proven not only to not work, but to do active harm. In the case of AIDS, it was a previously banned toxic substance, which they gave, as you pointed out, in super high doses, and this guy, people say, oh, you're a homophobe. Anybody that questions anything about the AIDS narrative is a homophobe. Well, the biggest researchers were gay men. John Lauritsen, whose training was in statistical analysis at Harvard, he was on this for decades, but he just passed away recently. He estimated that at least 300,000 gay men were murdered by AZT.
Yeah, I just heard that. Yeah. So I have to, unfortunately, we're almost out of time, but there's something I need to ask you that I've been asking almost all my guests recently. So considering the lies, considering the World Economic Forum and the way everyone talks about there's too many people on this planet, do you feel like this whole COVID scamdemic was orchestrated? And do you feel like we might be in a situation where the global elites are culling the population?
I'll limit my answer to the time you have. How much time do I have to answer this question?
A couple minutes.
Okay. Here's what I know for sure. A lot of people's bread got buttered by the COVID thing, right? So, all the bogus scientists out there getting grants for doing nothing but nonsense. The Full Employment Act for them. Obviously, the pharmaceutical industries had a payday. The hospital groups had a massive payday because they got all this COVID money. The school teachers unions got free vacation for their members for a year and a half. The public schools got tremendous influxes of money. By the way, which were used. There was a hook in that. They also had to accept that COVID money. They had to also accept accelerating the critical race theory stuff, accelerating the gender confusion stuff. So those people's bread is being buttered. So yeah, a lot. So I know for an absolute fact, a lot of people's bread got buttered by this thing to an enormous, the ad agency people, the PR people, the public. I mean, right. So is there a plan to reduce the human population? Um, it sure looks that way. I
That's
mean,
what I
that's my
say.
short answer. I mean, if
Unfortunately,
I
we have to speculate. This shows the truth expedition, but truth, what's truth anymore? 2+2 isn't even 4 anymore, according to the Canadian Mathematics Association. I mean,
right.
it's like you have to speculate to a certain degree. They talk about it. There's excess death is through the roof. It's just
They're degrading every aspect of society. I mean, they're degrading our energy infrastructure, which we really haven't felt the full impact of yet, but we will. Like it or not, we live on electricity and fossil fuel. Like that's why we're warm. That's why we're warm in the winter, and you guys need to be warm in the winter.
Yeah.
And that's why we're cool in the summer, and that's why food appears in our supermarkets. I mean, it may not be the most, ideal ecological system, and there's ways we can improve on it. But you pull that out, and we're dying and starving, and they are methodically, whether it's through idiocy or through plan or through weaponizing idiots through a plan, they are methodically undermining our energy system, all of it, and that will inflict a lot of death on a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, we are getting close to out of time here. Do you have any final questions, Dave? I bet you got a bunch.
Well, of course, I have a lot of questions, but I think my big takeaway here from our conversation with Ken has been that they've really taken like normal things in life, for example, death, and they've really weaponized those things to really, create a environment of fear, and as David Icke says, fear is the currency of control. If you want to control people, you have them in a constant state of fear. It's like that trauma-based mind control, I think is what that phrase is. And if you're always in this fight or flight mode and you're always in this fearful state, you're a lot easier controlled by the powers that be. So I think that's a huge takeaway for me, that they're taking normal things and are weaponizing them to create a fearful state for us. And I just want to throw out, too, that there's a local group here called Medical Justice MN that's all about fighting back. They have some lawsuits against the hospital systems who are putting their loved ones on remdesivir and the vents and everything. So we actually have a local group here, Medical Justice MN, that's fighting back against that. So, but this has been an awesome, a very enlightening conversation here, Ken. So thank you so much for joining us here today.
Yeah, I want to say thank you too, Ken, and I think we'll have to have you back on here when your new book comes out, and I'd like to talk to you more about that. But thank you, everyone, for tuning in to another amazing episode of The Truth Expedition. Don't shed on me, and don't tread on me.